This lesson is about ancient Egyptian culture. Egyptian culture developed at roughly the same time as Mesopotamian cultures, and like Mesopotamia, was a river valley civilization. The Egyptians recognized the significance of the Nile to their culture. In a hymn to the Nile, they recognized this important river as the bringer of food, rich in provisions, creator of all good, Lord of majesty, sweet of fragrance, he who makes every beloved tree grow. The Nile is a unique river beginning in the heart of Africa and coursing northward for thousands of miles. It is the longest river in the world. Thanks to the Nile, the river was capable of producing abundant harvests alongside its banks. The miracle of the Nile was its annual flooding. The river rose in the summer from rains in Central Africa, crested in Egypt during September and October, and left a deposit of silt that enriched the soil. This enriched soil darkened in color, becoming black, which led Egyptians to refer to their homeland as Kemet, which means black land. Egypt was an agrarian culture. This means that agriculture was its primary economic activity. The surpluses of food the rich soil made possible made Egypt prosperous. In addition to its role in Egyptian agriculture, the Nile was a vital transportation network which helped to facilitate communication between the people living throughout its realm. Unlike Mesopotamia, which was under constant threat of invasion by surrounding enemies, Egypt's geography and topography offered it natural protection and was a factor in its early history. Historians acknowledge that there are three distinct periods of Egyptian history: the Old Kingdom, the Middle Kingdom, and the New Kingdom. Each era had unique characteristics important to understanding this historic culture. The first Egyptian royal was a man named Menes. Menes united Upper and Lower Egypt, which had each consisted of smaller units of land under the control of tribal chieftains. Menes rose to power around 3100 BC and ruled for about 60 years. Sometimes, Menes is known as Narmer, but that name references the same figure. Ancient Egyptian history is comprised of 31 dynasties. The Old Kingdom encompassed the third through the sixth of these dynasties. The Old Kingdom was an age of prosperity and splendor. Its capital city was Memphis. No, not the one in Tennessee. Kingship was a divine institution in Egypt, and the deification of pharaohs started during the Old Kingdom era. Next to the Nile River, the pharaoh was the most important source of life for ancient Egyptians. While ancient Egyptians perceived the Nile River made possible the abundant food source they enjoyed, pharaohs were seen as gods and absolute rulers in Egypt. Read Hymn to Pharaoh that has been uploaded to the Canvas page for this course. Although it is true that during the Old Kingdom era pharaohs had absolute power, as time progressed and Egyptian society grew in numbers and complexity, an administrative infrastructure grew around them to help the kingdom run more efficiently. Central to this bureaucracy was an official called a vizier. Viziers reported directly to the pharaohs. He was in charge of all administrative departments, including the police, public works, and the two most important ministries, agriculture and the treasury. For administrative purposes, Egypt was divided into provinces or nomes, as they were later called by Greeks. There were 22 such units in Upper and 20 in Lower Egypt. A governor, called by the Greeks a nomarch, was head of each nome and was responsible to the king and vizier. Nomarchs, however, tended to build up large holdings of land and power within their nomes, creating potential rivalries with the pharaohs. The theory of divine order. The Old Kingdom eventually collapsed. After a brief and chaotic period known as the First Intermediate Period, the king of Thebes, Mentuhotep, reunified all of Egypt and ushered in a new period of stability that would last for another 400 years. Much of the Middle Kingdom history is centered around the 12th dynasty, founded by Amenemhet I, Amenemhet Wa, vizier who established himself and his successors as pharaohs. Egyptians would later portray the Middle Kingdom as its golden age. Several factors contributed to this view, including its stable and effective governmental structures. But it is perhaps recognized as a golden era because it was a time when pharaohs showed greater concern for the people. In the previous Old Kingdom era, pharaohs had been viewed as inaccessible god-kings. In the Middle Kingdom, they were now portrayed as shepherds with responsibilities to build public works and provide for the public welfare. In the Old and Middle Kingdoms, Egyptian society had a simple structure that was organized along hierarchical lines with the god-king at the top. The king was surrounded by an upper class of nobles and priests who participated in the elaborate rituals of life that surrounded the pharaoh. This ruling class ran the government and managed its own landed estates, which provided much of its wealth. Just below the upper classes were merchants and artisans. Merchants engaged in trade up and down the Nile, as well as in town and village markets. Some merchants engaged in international trade by acting as the king's emissary, engaging in trade with nearby Crete, Syria, and Nubia. The largest number of people in Egypt were those at the bottom, the farmers and the enslaved. These people worked the land. In theory, the king owned all the land but granted out portions of it to his subjects. Large portions of the land belonged to nobles and temple complexes. But most in the lower classes owned no land and were serfs with few rights or enslaved workers with even fewer rights. Egypt produced a culture that dazzled and awed its later conquerors. The Egyptians' technical achievements alone were awe-inspiring. Nowhere was this more visible than in the construction of its pyramids. Ancient Egyptian language included no word for religion. That's because spirituality was an inescapable part of the worldview the ancient Egyptians held. The ancients possessed a remarkable number of gods associated with heavenly bodies and natural phenomena. Two groups, sun gods and land gods, came to have special prominence. The sun was the source of all life and hence worthy of worship and adulation. The sun god was known as Re, and his main temple was in Atum. River and land deities included Osiris and Isis. Their child was Horus. Osiris was arguably one of Egypt's most revered and most feared deities. He was a symbol of resurrection and a judge of the dead. The dead were to give an account of the deeds they committed while living to Osiris to show if they were worthy of reward by him. As seen in the Book of the Dead, magical incantations were used to ensure a favorable journey to a happy afterlife, and as a way of pleasing Osiris. You will read excerpts from the Book of the Dead either in class or online. Without a doubt, the greatest achievement of ancient Egypt is the construction of the pyramids. Pyramids were built during Egypt's Old Kingdom era. Not built in isolation, pyramids were constructed as a part of a larger complex dedicated to the dead, in effect, a city of the dead. The area included a large pyramid which was meant to be for the king's burial, smaller pyramids for his family, and mastabas, regular structures with flat roofs, as tombs for pharaoh's officials. The rooms were furnished with numerous supplies reflecting their belief in an active life in the eternal. The Great Pyramid at Giza, shown here, was constructed around 2540 BC by Pharaoh Khufu. Measuring 481 feet high and 756 feet on all sides, its four sides are almost precisely oriented to the 4 points on the compass. An orienteering and engineering feat unmatched for its time. Egyptian art was functional and formulaic. Artists were expected to follow strict guidelines regarding proportionality and presentation. The art they produced largely served religious and ceremonial purposes. Such artwork included wall paintings and statues of gods and goddesses. The Middle Kingdom eventually ended, and another period of instability and fracturing occurred. Egypt witnessed an invasion by a Semitic-speaking people known as the Hyksos. The Hyksos came to dominate Egypt and, with their conquest, introduced Egypt to Bronze Age technologies for agriculture and warfare. One of the most powerful innovations the Hyksos introduced to the Egyptians was the chariot. In a twist of irony, the Egyptians would use this technology to throw off Hyksos domination and establish a unified dynastic kingdom again. Pharaoh Ahmose I is credited with expelling the Hyksos and reuniting Egypt. He is considered the first pharaoh of Egypt's New Kingdom era. For the next 4.5 centuries, Egypt would be the most powerful kingdom in the Near East. Its pharaohs took the kingdom in a new militaristic direction, with viziers only chosen from among decorated military commanders. Notable leaders during Egypt's New Kingdom era were Thutmose III, Amenhotep III and his son Amenhotep IV, and Ramses II.